reading in the same book, but to look at it. I can barely pick the wrong one. You know why I managed to do that? A couple of words that are at play. And I tried to give you some idea. Can everybody see that for the most part? So sometimes we use this interchangeably, at least the first three. And I'll put this one up here. Reverend. I'll say a word about that in a minute. So a lot of times
doesn't show up on the.
Doesn't show up.
The black does, but the red doesn't.
Well, dang. All right. Reverend. So we say, okay, who's the pastor of the church? Mike's the pastor. He's the senior minister. He's the one that was ordained elder. Well, those are not always interchangeable words. Generally speaking, this one is, but this one is not. There is some great dispute among biblical scholars and biblical historians about whether or not these two words are interchangeable. And the more I look at it, the more I think that they are. And I'll explain that in a minute. This one is absolutely not interchangeable, and it is different in and of itself. I'll explain all that. This, however, is an honorific title. It has nothing to do with the Bible. I'm kind of uncomfortable saying that because in a way it does, but it's a formal title of honor. It's like saying, Your Majesty, or if Gary Smith was going to be introduced at something, they would say the Honorable Representative Gary Smith, or the Mayor, or whatever, or even the governor's official honorific is His Excellency, the Governor of South Carolina. That's the same thing. Reverend means one who is set apart in holy service, service of the reverential and things like that. So it's it really is. I don't correct people because I have as bad English as anybody else, but it's really technically, grammatically incorrect to call somebody Reverend so and so.
What is it if you put Right Reverend in front of it?
That's bishop. That's a bishop.
Okay, that means bishop.
In the Right Reverend is how Protestant bishops are. The Catholic bishop of Charleston is the most reverend. I don't know. But so like in Right Reverend is an English thing because members of Parliament over here, members of Congress are called the Honorable Senator or whatever, but they say the Right Honorable Member from London or whatever. So right just is some adjective that they put on there, but so Right Reverend is a bishop, and we use we would use that too. Lutherans do it strangely. They call their bishops Reverend Bishop, the Reverend Bishop. It's always when you write it, you always have to put the definite article in front of it, whether you put that right or whatever, but it's always the Reverend whatever. That's neither here nor there. That's not the Bible. That's more or less, something that came with titles. So let's look at this. So I wanted to show you something. So when we're talking about this, we're kind of talking about, we're not going to argue from the sake of what we do as Methodists or what Presbyterians do or what Baptists do or whatever. I'll show you some of that, but I'm just going to point these things out to you so you can kind of come to see that it's not as easy as you might think. So there are 3 words for minister in the New Testament. One is this first one here, and it's pronounced liturgikos. Now, this is interesting because this is the word we get our word liturgy from. Our liturgy means our style of worship, what we do in worship, the order of worship, how we worship. Everybody has a liturgy. Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Baptists, Episcopalians, however you worship, that's your standard liturgy. So the word pertains to worship in a sense. The word liturgikos means a divinely authorized, someone divinely authorized in sacred ministry, one who performs, or that which is performed, what is pleasing and acceptable to the all-holy God. Someone who officially serves the sovereign, that is king. Let me get that. It said Greenville Hospital. Hello? Nope, it's not for me.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, it's not for me. But strange. Let me cut that off. But it's right here. So in this sense, this is somebody look up Acts 13:10. Somebody look up Romans 15:27, and somebody look up Hebrews 10:11. And then cut this down. I thought I did. Then you can see each use of the word there. Acts 13 and 10. Anybody have that? All right. Would you?
You are a child of the devil and an enemy of everything that's right. You're full of all kinds of deceit and trickery. Will you never stop perverting the right ways of the Lord?
All right. Somebody read Romans 15:27.
They were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have shared in the Jews' spiritual blessings, they owe it to the Jews to share with them their material blessings. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Hebrews 10:11.
Every priest goes to work at the altar each day, offers the same old sacrifices year in, year out, and never makes a dent in the sin problem.
So, in the first two, it seems strange, but it's just something owed, a service or something that is owed to. So this sacred ministry, and there is. Let's see if I can say this. So in Greek, there are multiple words that can be used to describe one thing, and then sometimes there's one word that can be used to describe multiple things, if that makes sense. Like the word love, there are at least 5 different words in Greek for love. We only have one word for love. But in terms of, let's say, sin, there are at least, I would say, 10 different words for the word sin. And in the Lord's Prayer, depending on what version of the Lord's Prayer you use, there are at least 4 of those words that are in the Lord's Prayer. Which is why we have trespasses, debts, sins, and sometimes translated, anyway, those 3 at least. So, a minister, let's just go. A minister is one who renders a service, particularly performs something that is pleasing to or owed to God, and we owe God our worship. So, in this sense, it is interesting because everybody owes God their worship. But what becomes problematic is that this is a person who is divinely authorized to do this. So now you get into a situation of who is divinely authorized. Men only? Men and women? Or what? Let's go down to Huperetes. A Huperetes is an underling, a servant. Technically, this is the most fascinating thing. That word here again is, y'all ever saw those pictures of the Phoenicians and Romans and everybody with those boats that they would go around the Mediterranean and there'd be tons of rowers and everything? Well, in some of these boats, they had upper deck rowers and lower deck rowers. Huperetes were the lower deck rowers. They weren't even they didn't even get first seat at the rowing table. They got stuck down under the deck where it was hot, where it was awful, where it was sweaty and stinky and just grunt work down there. And so these were subordinates. So here you go from liturgikos, which means someone divinely authorized, to now you got a subordinate person. So the word technically means a subordinate rower on a boat, but it's now someone who serves God in a subordinate ministerial service. These in New Testament times were also, this was the same word used for an assistant or an attendant of a judge or a magistrate, in the sense that they operated like U.S. Marshals. They would serve papers on people from the court, deputy sheriffs almost. They were also an officer or a sexton in a court. Now today, if you ever hear the word sexton is the glorified word in the English-speaking churches, Methodist mainly and Episcopalian, for janitor. This was the one, but its original meaning was one who had the oversight of the caretaking of the house, or the palace, or the judge's chambers, or the court, or in the case of this, the temple. So the person who had oversight of the caretaking of the temple. Now, if you think I'm muddying the waters, I am, and I'm doing it on purpose because I'm showing you what the Bible says, and then we'll get to the other. It's also one who aids another in their work, such as an assistant of the preacher of the gospel. Peter even calls himself that in one of these passages. We'll just move on just for a minute. Hiergeo. That's really hard to say, but is the last one. Somebody who performs sacred rites, someone who does temple work, such as offering acceptable sacrifices to God, can be interpreted as ministering as a priest. Well, this is tough, because the way we use the word minister is that the ministry of Jesus Christ belongs to all people. And so here's the semantic question: is the ministry the sole role of the clergy, or is it the job of everybody? And can you be a minister and not be a member of the clergy? And of course, everybody from the Roman Catholic Church all the way over to our side of the church, Pentecostals, Methodist, Baptist, all the rest would say ministers are everybody, male and female, clergy and laity, and there's no differentiation. That's fine, and that's good, and I believe that. But then you get into the actual Greek problem of, well, what does minister mean? Does minister, because it says here, somebody divinely authorized by God. It also says someone, a sexton, who is in charge of ordering the temple. It also says someone who is a priest of God, someone who is who aids in the work of God, someone who serves the Lord but in subordinate ministerial service. Again, those sort of seem to be conflicting. Are you in charge or are you subordinate? Then someone who performs sacred rites, someone who ministers as a priest. So again, that sort of maybe makes it a little bit more muddy than we would think when we're using Greek. And that's kind of what I want to do, just to show you that what we have is not necessarily as clear-cut as we might think. Let's skip this next part, except that top page that says the ministry of the church is primarily the work of the members in the activity of worship towards God, nurture towards each other, and witness towards the world. Internal structures for church governance are not the main ministry of the church, but are necessary equipping and mobilizing of the saints for the work of ministry. We'll come back to these things here in just a minute, but I want to jump over to the one that says pastor. So go to the page that says pastor at top. It's highlighted, it's bold black. So the word pastor comes from the Hebrew word that means to feed. And it was turned into, in the Old Testament, the word for shepherd. The word is employed figuratively, besides the literal stuff, in the Bible, the same way it's now used to describe a stated minister appointed to watch over and instruct the congregation. Jesus is the good shepherd, and we are under shepherds of the pastors are the good shepherds. So now here we get into a little bit more specifics about men and women according to just the linguistics of the thing. The term pastor is translated into the Greek as poimen, same thing, but it occurs only one time in Ephesians 4:11. It's the name given to ministers of the gospel in the New Testament and by the early church. reason one, Ephesians 4:11 treats pastors and teachers as one group grammatically, and suggests that the chief role of the pastor is feeding the flock through teaching, which is a role that's assigned to bishops in 1 Timothy 3:2. There, I want you to turn over to 1 Timothy 3:2, because that's where we have been looking at 1 Timothy. We looked at chapter 2, which has the role of women, but we can't really get to that part without, we can't really understand chapter 2 without looking at chapter 3. So, this is the faithful saying, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. So, let's look right here. He desires the position of a bishop. A bishop, and it goes on to say, must be blameless, blah, 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 able to teach. This is important because it clearly says that teaching is the role of the bishop. I could say as an aside that this is clearly where we, as United Methodists, have fallen off the rails. Our bishops no longer teach. It's been a long time since the bishops had a teaching capacity in the church. Our bishops are administrators. And I mean, that might sound groundbreaking, earth-shattering to some people, but you can't look at the past 10 years in any conference around the world of the Methodist Church and say that bishops teach. They don't. So this thing clearly assigns teaching to this role. Now look over to 1 Timothy in 3:2. Let me get it. Somebody have a different version of the Bible than me. What I do with my phone? Do you know?
Eastern Standard Version.
There we go. You got English Standard?
Version.
Read 1 Timothy 3, 1 and 2 for me out of your version.
Okay. Well, I just lost it, but it's okay. Here we go.
You got it? Go ahead and read it.
Go ahead.
Here is a trustworthy saying, whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, and able to teach.
Okay. So you see that the word that's translated bishop is overseer there. That's interesting. But now what I want to do, I want you to hold up that. This is, I'm trying to make a whole lot of points at one time, but I want to try to do it. I'm going to just find this one for you. Titus 1:9 says, this is with regard to qualifications for elders, and the word for elder here is presbyteros, and this is the one that they argue is interchangeable, that scholars and theologians argue is interchangeable. If you ask a Roman Catholic or a Greek Orthodox or an Episcopalian, they would say no. But then they would put an asterisk by it and said, except. Anytime you say no, but, or no, except, you might as well go ahead and just say yes. If you ask a Methodist, a Baptist, a Presbyterian, or whatever, they would say, yeah, this is the same thing. show you why in just a minute. But what gets them together here, though, in Titus, is that under the qualifications of elders, verse 9 says, he must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he will be able to teach in sound doctrine and to rebuke those who contradict it. See, so the roles are similar, the job is similar. The role of the elder, which is also the role of the pastor, is the role of the bishop, is to teach. In actuality, this is the strangest thing, because when I was a kid, growing up, and ever since I've become a minister, I have heard pastors, see, and I use those terms interchangeably too, see, I'm just subconscious. But y'all will probably recognize this, particularly if you're from the South. We generally refer to folks as one of two things, who are the ordained people in charge of the church. We either call them pastor, or we might call them preacher, right? Preacher. Now, if they were uppity churches in town, they would call them, that's what we would say. They would call their pastor doctor, so and so. But, or if they were higher up the scale, like Episcopalians, they might call them father or something. But generally speaking, we would say preacher or pastor. And I've been called that. I don't correct people. It's not wrong. It's just that's not the only thing I do. And actually, it's not biblically not the most important thing I do. The most important thing a pastor does is teach, according to the Bible. And pastors that don't teach now we may not teach well, but I would much rather, what I mean by that is, I don't want to teach anything wrong, and I'd rather not teach if I was going to teach anything wrong. I will always teach you rightly. It just may not be a good lesson. You know what I mean? You may be bored stiff, or you may just come away thinking, what did he say? It may not be wrong, but you just may not get anything out of it. But I know tons of ministers, and it just irks me. And I used to grill people at the Board of Ordained Ministry or the district committee when I was on those about, why don't you teach? What are you doing? We'd like to visit, or I'm working on my sermon. Well, your sermon must be a Jim Dandy sermon for you not to be doing anything the rest of the week but working on your sermon, But the primary biblical role is to teach. Why is that? Because our job is to build up the church, to equip the saints for the ministry of the church, is what the Bible says. You can't be equipped if you aren't getting equipped. If the pastor is a shepherd, and the role of the shepherd is to feed the sheep, what you gonna get fed with if he's not feeding you? Does that make sense? I get kind of frustrated on that one there.
There's a chart. Excuse me. There's a chart in this one that has 1 Timothy and Titus side by side, and it says both of them have above reproach, husband of one wife, self-control, hospitable, but then Timothy has sober-minded, respectable, and able to teach, whereas Titus says disciplined and able to give instruction instead of teaches to give instruction.
So Titus says able to, you said Titus says able to give instruction?
Yes.
And that is...
Titus 1:9.
I'm pulling it up in my Greek thing here. Titus 1:9. Well, yes, that is very interesting. Parakaleo, and it means to exhort, to admonish, to persuade. So it's a little bit differently, but you've got to be doing that with some kind of doctrine. So it's similar, but it's not, it's not the same.
Yeah, my translation is the King James, the
New King James,
And it said, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict.
Okay, let's do this, because y'all are chomping at the bit to get to the meat. So I won't keep you on the pastor one. Let's look over at elder. Turn your page to elder, because I think this is a very interesting one. So elder in the Bible is specifically rendered as presbyteros. We would say presbyteros, but Greek is pronounced. Again, like I said, there's this notion, this argument that episkopos is the same thing. Pastor definitely is the same thing. So let's look at what elder is. So among the Roman Catholics, the Orthodox, and the Anglicans, there are 3 orders of ministry. They call them historic orders of ministry. They date all the way back to the early church. The orders are bishops, elders, and deacons. The word priest is an English word that comes from presbyteros. So it's not anything fancy. It just is an English version of this word, because it's kind of hard to go around saying presbyteros. That's where that comes from. The duties and functions of a priest are generally the same as a Protestant pastor, a Protestant elder. But if you find yourself in a denomination that uses the title priest, they hold that they are in apostolic succession. They are in a direct line of descendants from the apostle by virtue of the laying on of hands from their bishop that went back to his bishop, to that bishop, to that bishop, all the way back to St. Peter. Now, Protestants, the rest of us, believe that we're in apostolic succession spiritually. We're successors of the apostles by virtue of the fact that we hold and proclaim their teaching. And so, but we don't, anyway, that's neither here nor there. Methodists and the Methodist family of churches have 2 orders of ministry that we recognize: elders and deacons. And bishops are not a third order. Bishops are elders who are set apart for a specific ministry of oversight, overseer. So Methodists historically would argue that presbyteros and episkopos are the same thing. That's how we do it. And all Methodist bodies who came out of us do the same thing. Church of God, Pentecostals, Nazarenes, Wesleyans, all of them do the same thing. If they have an overseer, and some don't even call them bishops anymore, they call them overseers. But overseers are nothing more than elders who are elected out of the ranks. And they have a job that's a little bit different for a while. Let's go look at the Presbyterians and the Baptists for a minute, and then we'll come back. Presbyterian churches they have 2 classes of elders. They have teaching elders and ruling elders. This is an interesting group. The teaching elders are the pastors. The ruling elders are laymen. They're set apart to assist the minister in the, in the oversight of the flock and the ruling of the flock. And they make up what's called the Kirk session. Kirk is the Scottish word for church. It's like the church council. Baptists and all the congregational churches, the pastor, the called pastor, the congregation calls the pastor, is designated an elder, but there is no rule, and I found this strange. And I even went to Albert Mohler, who's the president of the Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, and a book he wrote to make sure that this was accurate, and sure enough it is. there's no rule among Baptists that pastors have to be ordained. And I just had no idea that was it. But deacons do have to be ordained. Anybody in here besides Jim who's ever been ordained a deacon? Anybody? So deacons are ordained. They're set apart, and their job in the church is very broad. Am I right, Jim? Very broad. They're supposed to help with the management and oversight of the congregation, everything from visitation to prayer to worship leadership to business. What am I leaving out? Everything. Properties. See, they do the work. They do the work of the whole church council, basically. Of the so they are the finance committee. They are the trustees. They are the PPRC. They are the whole thing. So, and generally, there's any number between 7 and on up, right? In terms of deacons. In our church, deacons are set apart people, and they're ordained, but they're ordained to serve in the church, much like in the Baptist church. But they are also, I think it's for teaching and service, I think is what they do. Anyway, I wanted to show you what the responsibilities and duties of elders in the Methodist Church are, so you can see this is what the Book of Discipline says that I'm supposed to be doing, or any elder who you've ever had is supposed to be doing. And I like the fact that number one, the responsibilities of elders and duties are derived from authority given in ordination of a fourfold ministry of word, sacrament, order, and service. Let's see. Elders are authorized to preach and teach the word, to provide pastoral care and counsel, to administer the sacraments, and order the life of the church for service and mission and ministry as pastors, superintendents, bishops. Just notice that they included elders and bishops in the same thing. And then it's okay. So breaking it down. Word. Main job, to preach the Word of God, lead in worship, read and teach Scriptures, engage people in study and witness, to ensure the faithful transmission of the Christian faith, to lead people in discipleship and evangelistic outreach that others might come to know Christ and follow Him. And then all this stuff about baptism and communion, and then be the administrative officer of the church under order, oversight to educational programs, goal setting, planning, evaluation, and then service to embody the teachings of Jesus in servant ministry and servant leadership, order the life of the congregation for discipleship in the world, etc., etc. So the role of a pastor is far-reaching, and it is, and you could also say the same thing for the deacon. But the role of the pastor, the elder, according to the Bible, is almost so much that one person, it's just impossible for one person to do. I mean, you look at this stuff and say, there's no way one person can do all this. It might very well be why Paul said, perhaps you shouldn't get married. Now, I'm not saying that, about me, but he didn't say not to. But he did indicate that it would be easier for someone in the ministry of the elder to not be married, because your devotion, your whole attention is supposed to be given to that. But now let's look, because here's what I'm going to do. Miss Dolores brought this up, and this gets into the real discussion. And it does compare Titus and 1 Timothy with regards to the qualifications for elders. So turn to that. Let's look at that. This saying is sure. If anyone aspires to the office of bishop, and we're going to equate that with elder right now, he desires a noble task. Now, let me go over here and show you there is something in there that is interesting. And that is the word anthropos. And the word anthropos means man. Now, you don't have it there, but it says if anyone desires or aspires to the office of bishop, he, and that's the word anthropos, he, anthropos, a man, desires a noble task. Now, this is where modern translators enter the fray, and they could be right and they could be wrong. Because the word anthropos has been used to define or has been defined as human being. The study of anthropology is the study of human origin and stuff like that. Now the question is, what was the most common usage in the first century? And it is apparent that the most common usage in the first century was man, a male. Only later did it come to encompass all of humanity. That's why most translations, Miss Grace, you got a new King James? You got what?
Yeah, I have it.
You got NIV, you got ESV?
Yes.
Y'all look up 1 Timothy 3:1. If anybody's got a different version than that, look it up for me. And let's just see what you got here. You got King James. Okay, you got King James. Okay. All right. Then find that, because that'll be different. Miss Bobby, you got the Living Bible, don't you? All right. Look that up for me.
Which one is it?
1 Timothy 3:1. All right, let's start with Tip. 3:1.
Here is a trustworthy saying, whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task.
So that one just left it out entirely.
Yep.
Whoever desires a noble task. So it avoided the male-female. Miss Bobby, you got it?
It is a true saying that if a man wants to be a pastor, he has a good ambition.
Okay, so this one says man and he. All right. You want to read it?
Sure. This is a true saying. If a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work.
That's the King James. Miss Grace, what's the New King James say?
This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work.
All right, Gardner?
The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task.
So, generally speaking, with the exception of the New International Version, NIV, all of them say he, and some of them go on to say man, to qualify that. So we're looking at this. Now let's look at qualification. So aspire. Here's a qualification. So first, let's do this. We'll come back to it. So first, under qualifications, generally speaking, we'll go with the consensus. It's a he. So here's qualification. The is aspiration. So this was an interesting thing because aspiration does not necessarily indicate call, because that's a different word. Call is vocare, and so this is someone who wants it not because they're pressed into it, but who wants to be an elder because they desire to serve the Lord. They have no other aspiration but to serve God. So we're going to put, here's this desire to serve God. Therefore, it is necessary for them to be irreproachable. Let's see what it might say in another translation. Must be above reproach. This is a way of living that would not cause others to think badly of the church, or badly of Jesus, or badly of the Christian faith. So you don't want someone who is your bishop or who is your pastor to be someone who you always have to apologize for their behavior, or who is always going to cause the church to be embarrassed, or are going to bring shame on Jesus or shame on the Christian faith. So you got to see that. Above, I can't spell above reproach. Now here's where you get into more gender stuff. The husband of one wife. The Greek renders it, though, one woman's husband. That can imply something different. What now? We won't get into does this mean married after divorce, or can you get married after death, or anything like that? The biggest issue for our discussion is that it specifically speaks of husband and of wife. Husband is the word aner, and it simply means a male person of mature age and stature who is betrothed or betrothed. Whereas wife, I think I told you this last time, is the word gyne, G-Y-N-E, where you get the word gynecologist. It means female. So there again is a gender-specific issue that is brought up with regards to qualification. They also have to be sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, whatever. Some of your words say this. This means that they have to be of sound mind, and the image is of the demoniac who was freed by Jesus. Now think about this. When this person was demon-possessed, he was not of his right mind. He was not of a good mind. He was not of one mind. He had all sorts of things going on, occupying his mind. He was not in any shape in his right mind. So when it says a sound mind, it means the opposite of all that. you're focused only on Jesus, you're single-minded, that the things of God are most important, that, you love the Lord more than you love anything else. It's very difficult for us to understand this, and it sounds harsh, but men are supposed to love God, love Christ more than they love their wives. And wives are supposed to love Christ more than they love their husbands. And men and women are supposed to love Christ more than they love their children. And children are supposed to love Christ more than they love their parents. That seems kind of weird and it seems kind of harsh to an outsider. But the reality is that's the lineup. Jesus, family, etc., etc. And if that is out of order, like we talked about last week, if that one thing is out of order, everything else is out of order. So when it says sober-minded, it means that has to be the direction of your mind. That Christ comes first. And I think, I don't want to start preaching again because we're running late, but I got nowhere to go. I think this is the problem with our churches. I think it's a problem with our families. I think it's a problem with our country. It's a problem with our preachers. That we got so many more things that occupy our minds than Jesus. And we love so many more things than Jesus. That's why we're in such a mess. It's why we can't get stuff right. And it's why even the best of us are prone to make the worst decisions and the worst messes possible. Let's go on down. Let me see, what verse am I on? Verse 2. Still. Okay. Respectable, honorable. This is somebody who just doesn't set out to step on people's toes or to be offensive, but will do it if necessary. They are proper in the sense that they, comport themselves in a way that doesn't give offense. But they don't mind saying the offensive thing if that's what has to be said. And I was working on my sermon yesterday, so I might be giving something away that might make the sermon, it might not. But every pastor I've talked to at the conference has faced the same thing that we're facing. That since COVID, and it's not COVID's fault, but since COVID, our churches have shrunk in a sense. People just didn't come back to church. It wasn't COVID's fault. It was actually, I think, a God thing, because what it was that the people who weren't really here for the right reasons just decided, there's no need for me to be a hypocrite. I enjoyed staying home, and so I'm going to stay home. And so the folks who have shown up are the ones who are here for who basically are here for the right reasons. That may be a smaller number. And then, since COVID, since that's been a reality, you hear all these people say, well, you need to do this and you need to do this to get people back, have parties and, set up, free lemonade. I'm just making this up. Free lemonade on the church lawn and free fried chicken after every Sunday service or something. Just bring them in. Do whatever you have to do to bring them in. But you know what? That is exactly not what Jesus did. Jesus never intentionally went around to be offensive, but Jesus never sugarcoated anything to people in order to draw bigger crowds.
He never sidestepped the issue.
He never did, though. And that's the thing. Jesus, it was almost like Jesus said the thing that would turn them away on purpose even though he didn't do it like that. And that was not his intent. But he wanted to get to the tough stuff first to say, look, if you don't like this, you don't need to be here. And nowadays, if you say something tough to a congregation, then they all get mad at you and say, we're not coming back because he hurt my feelings. But Jesus, go back to what I was talking about a minute ago. Jesus said, whoever does not hate his mother and father is not fit to follow me. You know, he wasn't telling us to break the, fourth commandment. He wasn't telling us to break the commandment. He was just putting things in perspective. You know, like he said, you can't serve God and mammon. You can't serve two masters. You'll either hate the one and love the other. Basically, he was saying you can't be fully devoted to two things at the same time. You got to give all your devotion to one or the other. And he used strong terms, and you know, but he said this is how it is. And yet Jesus changed the world. And I know we're talking about Jesus, but the disciples went on doing the same thing. And the early church did the same thing. They changed the world by telling the hard truth and not watering it down or sugarcoating it or covering it up to a later date to say in a private setting somewhere. This is what the congregation needed to hear, and it was what, hey, it's like, how many of you ever been in the military? Or still in the military? Let me ask you something. When y'all were Army? I don't know how fluffy the Navy does it, but so I'll just talk. It's extra fluffy. I love picking on there. But I know this. The day I went to Fort Jackson, they did not greet me with somebody waving palm branches at me and say, hey, would you like a pillow and some ice cream? They did not. I wanted to put my thumb in my mouth and get back in that truck and go back home crying to Mama when they were doing it.
I got to Fort Campbell on April Fool's Day. They had a lot of fun on that day.
Fort Gulf, Louisiana on July the 4th week.
Now, I tell you what. But you know what? That they knew that, and they do that same thing. I'm kidding with Eric. They do the same thing in the Navy. It's the Air Force that doesn't do it, but they hit you with that hard stuff because they know, you know what? You're in for a tough life. You sign up for a tough job. This is the real world. The real world is tough, and we need tough people to lead in the real world. And you're not joining the Mickey Mouse Club. And you know what? The church probably ought to say the same kind of thing. You're not joining the Mickey Mouse Club. You know, you're in the toughest, should be the toughest organization in the world because it's the toughest fight in the world because it's actually a fight for life and death and eternity. And you got to be ready for it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote that great book, The Cost of Discipleship. He didn't say the fun ride of discipleship. Jesus didn't say, if you want to be my disciple, take up a bunch of balloons and follow me. He said, take up an instrument of crucifixion and follow me. So just to say that. But going down to the next one. Must be verse 2. Must be hospitable. And this means that you should love strangers. Why should you love strangers? Well, because everybody's a stranger until they become a friend, unless they become an enemy, which, God help us, but that sometimes happens. But here's the thing that should be the truth of an elder as the leader of the church. By the way, the elder leads, but the elder should lead by example so that the other folks in the church, the other ministers in the church, do the same thing. So you should embrace people. You should welcome people. You know, it's why, we have community gardens and we have the free pantries and we have all of this and we do evangelistic things. It's not because we know these people, it's because we don't know them. And it's because we love them Not because we know them, but we love them because Jesus told us to love them enough to want what's better for them, and what's better for them is life in Christ. So we have to be welcoming in that regard. And then I'll stop here because the next one that comes up is not addicted to wine, and I think I need to go home and have a drink. No, I'm kidding. But skilled at teaching, didacticon, which is what I had over there early. Not every elder will be good at teaching and preaching. I alluded to that earlier. But he better well know it. Because you don't necessarily have to be able to teach publicly in a way that is, let me put it this way. I think personally that every elder should teach. Every pastor of a church should teach Bible study. That should go with the program. I, however, know that the vast majority of pastors don't teach Bible study. I'm not even going to ask you what your experience has been in the churches you've been in, because my guess is it's probably there's been less of it than not. But whether they're good at it or not is irrelevant as long as they know it. Because they can even be a very bad teacher, and you may not get anything out of what they taught to the group, but you may go to them privately and say, can you explain this to me? And it may come out like a brilliant genius. They may just be not the extroverted person that they necessarily needed to be to teach, but in a one-on-one situation, they may be able to enlighten you for, forever. But the bottom line is, you can't teach what you don't know. And I think that, more than laziness, is why a lot of pastors don't teach. Because I don't think they know it. And then there's some who know it, but they don't believe it. And that always just frightens me. Because, I don't mind telling you that I believe it. I believe every bit of it. And it may not make sense to me. There may be some things that I can't wrap my head around, and I certainly can't explain, but that doesn't matter. Because my brain is not capable of understanding the things of God. I am perfectly capable of accepting, what God. Every time I get in a situation like this, it does not hurt my feelings if God said to me what He said to Job. Well, listen, when you can make a giraffe, you get back to me on that. Did you make the Pleiades? Did you hang the moon? Can you make the north wind blow the snow? Can you make rivers run? Did you fill the ocean? Well, Job obviously has to say no. And that's what God said. Well, then,
Mike, before we go, just a question or two. The title of this is what does the Bible say about women serving as ministers, pastors, so on. Now, it's obvious that the Methodist Church doesn't go exactly by that. We have women ministers, we have women bishops. What's the answer to that?
So here's the answer to it. Based on, if you're going to take if you're going to take a truly literal reading of Titus and 1 Timothy, you come away with the fact that the office of elder and the office of bishop, if they're two offices or if they're the same office, in those two passages clearly indicate that it is a male-only vocation. However, the problem, and by the way, let me just say the word about deacons. Deacons are up for grabs because there were, even in the New Testament, they were women deacons. So deacons were up for grabs. But where the water gets muddy and why this has not been first what's called a first order doctrinal issue, is that the word minister is all encompassing. And the word minister can be applied to those who lead and who teach. Which, going back over here, and see, this is where I'm saying that I probably didn't, this is the night that I probably didn't do a good job teaching, because I didn't draw these out as, in my head it was perfect. But as it's come out here, it hasn't been. But so the minister's role, according to Scripture, a minister can be a male or female. Any Christian is a minister. But the words used in the New Testament, the Greek words, indicate that the role could be leading worship and it could be teaching. In 1 Timothy and in Titus, there was the duty of the elder, which clearly in those passages are reserved to a man, is teaching and leading in worship. So you see where the conflict comes in, and how it's been assumed and presumed upon for the past 2,000 years. I'll wrap this up this way. So, two things I want to say, and I'll do it quickly. So, there's something in theology called first order doctrine, second order doctrine, third order doctrine. Methodists don't tend to use that term. Those terms Methodists use essentials and non-essentials. Those are Wesley's words, which actually were St. Augustine's words, but Wesley borrowed that. But they mean the same thing. First order doctrines are absolutely essential doctrines. These are doctrines like the resurrection of Jesus, the bodily, literal resurrection of Jesus, the virgin birth of Jesus, the atoning sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, let me stop. I do want to take a minute. I was told, and this should not come as a surprise, but there's, I'll tell you that. Let me get back to this after this cuts off. You'll want to hear this. Okay, so that's first order stuff. Second order stuff is important, but it's not worth breaking fellowship over. It's important, like for instance, is the Lord's Supper a sacrament, or is it an ordinance? An ordinance, as some denominations say, is an ordinance. It's just a mandate that the Lord said do. Or is it a sacrament? Does it impart grace in some way? Those are second order. They're not important, but they're not worth breaking fellowship over. So that a Methodist church and a Baptist church, who has two different views on that, will not break fellowship over that. A third order doctrine is almost so far down the line that it's not even worth the argument outside of its own denomination. For instance, I'll just make one up, but this would be an example. Should deacons be allowed to be served if they're divorced? That doesn't pertain to, most, denominations. There's only a couple denominations that have this as an issue. And so that is such a, it's not that it's not important, but it's not important to anybody but their own denomination. I would say that women in the ministry are a second order doctrine. They're not a primary doctrine. And it's not so far down the list that it's not. The Southern Baptist Convention, when they start meeting on Sunday, they will debate this issue because it's become a big issue for the Baptists. Methodists, and I think I've told you historically, Wesley was not in favor of ordaining women, and he could not do it because the Church of England didn't. But he gave women an exhorter's license, which was something I think he just made up, to give them a license to basically preach, but not in the main Sunday service. They could preach other times. In fact, there's letters that Wesley wrote to tell women who were exhorters, who were doing a very good job, but they looked too much like preachers with their mannerisms and all of this. And he cautioned them not to do that. But as time went on and things began to, they began to understand Scripture differently, like Acts chapter 2, where it said, your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and things like that. They allowed that to happen, and they also based it on this, that while, yes, Timothy and 1 Timothy and Titus do say this, other scriptures that speak of ministry and ministers have a broader understanding. So it was certainly not an essential, not in first order, so we went that way.
Okay.
Today, Methodists, Episcopalians, Anglicans, Lutherans, Presbyterians, they all maintain that. The other thing that Baptist, Catholics, and the Orthodox do is a very biblical and historical argument, and you can't argue against it for the most part, and that is the fact that Jesus only chose male folks as his apostles. It's true that Mary Magdalene became a follower, a disciple, and Mary Magdalene was with the apostles, so was the Virgin Mary on Pentecost. And that Mary Magdalene was called, and has been called for the past 2,000 years, the apostle to the apostles, because she was the first one who went to tell the apostles about the resurrection of Jesus. So I think that it's biblical to say both. I think that if you're a Roman Catholic or a Southern Baptist or whatever, and you believe the Bible says that that women should not be in the primary role of an elder as the leader of a church, then I won't argue with you, because I think that there's a biblical case to be made. But I also think there's a biblical case to be made for the other way.
That clears it up. I appreciate it.
I hope it clears it up.
It does. It clears it
But
up.
I will say, it's like the argument with a Presbyterian on predestination. Everybody believes in predestination. We just believe it differently. But the Presbyterian version is strong. But I went to a Presbyterian seminary, and I can tell you, it is a strong biblical argument for the way Presbyterians understand predestination. At the same time, it is a good biblical argument, equally, for how we understand it, and how freedom of the will plays into it. But again, that's a second or maybe third level argument. What matters to me is what we believe about first order stuff. And if we can't agree on that, we're not unified as a church, we're not unified as Christians, and we're not being the people God called us to be. That's what's most important, because if we don't agree on that. Now, if you'll turn that off.